Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Only Murderers in the Building, the first two episodes of season one. So, of course, this is a Hulu show, if you didn't know. I went on to this and I watched the first two episodes. And the thing that I would say that I actually did like about this show is it tries to figure out a way to hook you in, or it tries to like make you want to just like kind of already say it's like, oh, okay, I can see where this is going. And eventually once that does work out, you're like, oh, okay. Because you can kind of understand like certain scenes where all of a sudden uh one character is to kind of see this thing off to the side and just be like, what the heck? And you're kind of waiting for that person to confront the other, and but you're also just kind of thinking like, well, there's probably going to be some kind of swerving thing of that, where all of a sudden like that person who was so upset by a thing that the other person had done will eventually end up possibly apologizing after this whole thing is over. But um I thought that this show, out of the first two episodes, this was really interesting. Like, you end up seeing kind of certain characters like individually and kind of like start to really invest in them because their stories are very interesting enough. Like, you have Steve Martin's character, who is Charles Hayden Savage, who Charles is seemingly an actor who had gotten kind of uh, one show that is usually mispronounced bozos, but it's brazos, and so it's to be this kind of detective show, and we seemingly have Martin Short's character, who is Oliver Putnam, who is to be this kind of like acting coach. And it seems that Oliver is to also try and get work, but it seems like he's really struggling. It seems like he's trying to put something together to make profit out of it, even if it's something as simple as a podcast, to just try and put something together, because there's a reason for that. We have Selena Gomez's character, who plays Mabel Mora, who, like, this character I think is really interesting because, like, it seems like this character, like, especially, like, we want to know more about compared to everyone else, just because it seems like her story, I'm like, okay, it seems like her story has something to do uh, with kind of the whole reason why we're going about with these three people with this story, and it seems like she's connected to the what's going on with the main part of the story, and so now it kind of gets me more and more interested in this character, to just be like, okay, like, I want to know more about Selena Gomez's character, and but I also like want like an ensemble piece. I want all these guys or all these people all coming together and figuring something more out. But like, it's also like, it's really interesting to see these characters either separated or together, because you just want to get to know more about these characters. But specifically Mabel's character, just because she's seemingly connected to the main story, because I'm trying to say this cryptically. So, uh, like, I liked this show. Like, it hooks you in the way that it should, and like, you're just kind of like, okay, I'm interested in more. I want to eventually see more of the show, and I'll go back to it and like start to kind of binge watch some more episodes, because like, it has me interested, it has me intrigued, and I kind of want to go into this show to see uh like if things I'm going to say are eventually going to pay off like later down the road. Like, wait a minute, like, what is this ring about, or what is this meeting about? Like, oh, are they all just gonna bizarrely just connect together with this whole one thing? and that's all of a sudden what's to make them the best of friends. And then we end up finding every little piece about these individual characters that eventually not each one of these three people all know every piece of that puzzle about, but maybe they'll forcibly have to at some point. So yeah, so definitely go and check out this show, especially if you like, especially like Hardy Boys or like the old like murder mystery kind of things. Go ahead and check out this show because of that. Especially if you like movies like Clue or something like that. If you enjoy that kind of stuff, where it's like that old fashioned murder mystery, not to sound like, oh, this is the oldest thing that you've ever heard. Like, no, like it's interesting. Like, I like the way of which that this is to like kind of be written out almost like a crime novel through some parts of this episode. It's really interesting. So for people that probably have seen any number of kind of like Nancy Drews and all kinds of stuff, go ahead and check out this show. It actually was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. So, but that said, let's do kind of the teeing up part of the show where I kind of almost like I pretty much almost go into spoilers because reasonably it's about that customary time to get people more intrigued about this show. So the teeing up version of this show is we are to have these three people all live in the same building complex, and uh, eventually we have a fire alarm go off in this building complex, and all of a sudden we end up having these people who are just like, really, like, and so all of a sudden these people are all forced to kind of go into this one restaurant, and each one of these three individuals who had shared an elevator in an early part of the pilot episode all eventually end up uh, reconnecting simply because of seemingly one show where they're like, oh my god, I'm so enthralled about this. And so all of a sudden, when they are to return back into their building, they end up finding some dead body, and they're like, "Okay, this person is dead." So they end up calling the police, and so like they have detectives who end up kind of finding the body, and so of course this detective is kind of questioning any number of these people. Eventually we'll find I believe within the second episode it seems like there was any number of people within this building who seemingly had a motive to kill this guy, uh, but they end up kind of finding out much like later about it. There's like, oh, like this was the guy who was the pain in the patukas, and like he was like requiring this and wanted us that, and that like that's why that we couldn't be able to use any number of things and whichever. So uh so yeah, like it becomes like the first two episodes are kind of interesting, but I'm kind of also leading out or leaving out the side stories of each one of these characters, which that's what I'll use or do in the spoilers of this. So yeah, interesting. Go ahead and check that out. Without a doubt, hopefully no one spoils the show, but really, like, like you get randos that all of a sudden is to just kind of like, oh well, I watched this whole show in one sit because people can watch a show however they want. Um, like to me, I don't have real true like I'm interested in the show, but like if anybody's to kind of say whatever about the show, um, like even if it's just kind of like talk about certain kind of thing, I'm like okay, whichever. Like, so um, like I thought this show was kind of interesting and kind of fun. Um, So let's go out of our way to see it's that customary double five time again to go into almost spoilers or really just into spoilers. So spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time you just spoil these two episodes. So early in the beginning of this episode, we have Steve Martin Charles, who is to be walking through the city. All of a sudden, he ends up bumping into one guy who's to mention like, "Oh yeah, like you were on that show Brazos," and the guy was just like, "Oh yeah, like I was." And so the guy was like, "Well, yeah, like me and my dad used to watch that show all the time." But then this guy is mentioning that that his dad is to seemingly have gotten like really sick, and that like like this guy goes out of his way to like mention how like in poor health that his father is, and so Charles is just like, well, like, hey, do you want to take a picture? And Charles immediately assumes that him and this guy and will take a picture, but then like the guy gives Charles this phone and like takes a picture like of like this guy and his wife, and so Charles is taking the picture of his of this random guy and his wife, and so Charles is just like, well, okay, like tell your father that I took that picture, and so like this guy's like, well, I'm sorry, sir, but like. My father is just so in poor health that he wouldn't even know who you are anymore. And so Charles is just like, oh my God, like, so why did you even tell me this story? Like, why, like we didn't even do a photo op or nothing, like, but whatever. So Charles ends up walking on, and so now we end up having Martin Short's character Oliver, who is to be walking to his apartment complex, and he's to wear this like this bright purple jacket, which I was like, you know what, this guy really like sticks out, and I thought that it's cool because like Martin Short uh like especially when he would like kind of do a lot of these shows, like immediately you would like always see like Martin Short kind of stick out for whatever reason. So Martin Short all of a sudden, or Oliver, is to be walking through the street, to all of a sudden be going through a crosswalk to kind of stop for a moment, and almost all of a sudden end up getting hit by some car. And Oliver's like, "Are you kidding me? Like, how could you not see this bright purple coat?" Which immediately I had to laugh at. And he was like, "How could you not see this coat? Like coming out of like this bright purple coat should not come up out of nowhere for you to have not seen." So Oliver continues to walk to go to his apartment complex. So now we end up having Mabel's character, who is Selena Gomez's character, who is kind of listening to music and just kind of kind of going about her day to eventually go into her complex. So every single one of these characters all meet into this elevator together, and so all of a sudden Oliver is like desperately trying to make small talk, and like neither one of the other people in this elevator are interested in Oliver's small talk whatsoever, because all of a sudden Oliver is to like see Mabel having these like Beat headphones. I'm wondering if that was a sponsor of this show, because I don't know, maybe they needed a sponsor. I don't know. I doubt it. Like it seems like I was just kind of waiting because I didn't see in the credits. I thought maybe like Lorne Michaels kind of put together some money for the show, because like all of a sudden I was starting to see like some like certain Saturday Night Live members, just besides the two, of course, we see here, and I was like, well, then obviously, like I was thinking, like Lorne Michaels was kind of doing something with this show, because when you usually have a lot of Saturday Night Live people together in one kind of show, because eventually we end up seeing quickly in the show, uh, we end up seeing Tina Fey, which like I remember and she ends up playing this girl called Cinda Canning, and she ends up playing like a brief thing in this show. So I'm like, okay, so is she? It seems like she's a recurring character because she's in 3 episodes. I'm like, okay, good. So there must be something about this like true crime story that she consistently gets involved in for one reason or another. So we eventually end up finding out that every single one of these characters are to be interested in these like true crime kind of stories, and that's all that actually connects them together. Besides being in that elevator where Oliver's make small talk about him losing his Beats headphones at one point, and so when Oliver was to get to his floor, we end up having Charles is like, ding, like, get out. Like even the elevator was telling you that like no one wanted to listen to that story. So Oliver ends up getting out and because he has a bunch of packages on him. So eventually everybody goes about their day, finds their floor and whichever. We end up having also this one guy who ends up getting into the elevator who was of course to be uh, God, what is his name already? Uh, Tim. And so Tim is to be holding this bag, this garbage bag, and he is to be on the phone, and he is to be like asking about some package. And it seems that there had been some package that had been sent to this other address. And so Tim is just kind of like, well, like, why does that happen all the time? Like, I really needed this package. So eventually, all these characters go off to go and do their true crimes, and they start listening to this episode. And so uh, we end up having Tina Fey's character, who is to eventually kind of play this woman who's be in this show. And so the big takeaway about this is like to have been something about like what was in I think some kind of like what was someone to have on them, and so eventually it was to be revealed that it was some kind of panties. So because they're all listening to this story, and then all of a sudden the fire alarm goes off. So they end up all trying to rush out of this building, and all of a sudden Charles is to be very observant to see weirdly some person who's wearing this white hooded getup, who is to all of a sudden be walking up flight of stairs instead of down. And so Charles notices that, and it's just like, okay, why is that guy going up when all of us are leaving? This seems weird. So eventually Charles is to go by the doorman, just like, is this a drill? Like, what is this? So like, no, like, hey guys, this is all legit. But like, it seems like there wasn't actually a fire. I guess it was somebody pulled a prank, and like it wasn't a drill or anything like that. So all of them decide to go to this one restaurant, and so all of a sudden Charles is to go on with his laptop to go and watch this true crimes thing. And so all of a sudden Oliver comes in, and like he is to like remember seeing this guy, like, oh hey, yeah, like we shared a conversation in the elevator. And so all of a sudden Oliver is to all of a sudden spot the fact that Charles is also watching the true crimes thing. He's like, what did they have? What did they have? So so all of a sudden they stop, and they're trying to like figure out this case together. And I'm just like, so this is how every single one of these three people are going to meet together. They're all going to connect because of this one true crimes thing. And so all of a sudden Mabel ends up coming in, and it's like, oh hey, yeah, the Beats, the headphone girl. And she ends up coming in, and she's like, "Oh, you guys are listening to the true crime." So all of them are getting together, and all of them are like, like they're all trying to figure out the crime together, and they're all trying to piece things together. And so Mabel's just like, "What was the thing that they had?" It's like, "Oh, panties." And it's like, "Oh, okay." So all of them are trying to figure that out. So after this is all done, and like basically after everyone's kind of heading back into the apartment complex, like these like people were talking so much so that they kind of like forgot about the time. And so Charles ends up deciding to so everybody just starts heading up to the building, and Charles, I think, was the first one really up there. And like, but here's the funny thing. So evidently when the bill for these people like sitting at this restaurant, when the bill came, Mabel was going to take the bill, but Oliver's like, well, no, like it's on me. And then all of a sudden, like, Oliver kind of takes the bill and gives it to Charles and then walks off, to where Charles is like stuck with the whole bill, because we end up finding out that Oliver doesn't really have a cent to his name. We end up finding that out about him, because like really in the like really we start in these first two episodes to get to know these people. We end up finding out that it seems that Oliver is like, I would assume, some kind of acting coach, but because we consistently have like Oliver even either uh, like trying to correct the way that somebody is to pronounce something, or like just kind of like uh, make a certain person want to pronounce something a certain kind of way that he wants it, to where you have a person having to deliver the same line like 10 different kind of times until Oliver is to like just be like, well, that's like sound like a real person this time around. So so what ends up happening is Charles, I think, is the first one to find this body, and then eventually the rest of the people go back to this floor. And so Charles is to call this detective, and so uh, like these three people are all trying to make the consensus of who either killed this guy, or they're making the consensus about like what he was doing before the time of his death. And so this detective kind of throws her hands up and is like, I'm sorry, like I hate these true crime people that are just trying to solve this case for me. Like, no, like, so uh so eventually like the body ends up getting cleaned, and so all three of them all head into uh their rooms. But then all of a sudden something is bugging them, and so every one of the people, all three of these people, all decide to collectively go into one another's like basically apartments, because they're like, we gotta figure out what the heck that guy had in that plastic bag. And so all three of them all go out to the garbage dumpster to try to siphon through all this trash and try to find what that bag was holding. And so because supposedly the detective is writing it off as some kind of suicide, and that there supposedly is some kind of letters that might say that, or some kind of like notes or something that might obviously say that he killed himself. And so eventually, when they go into the trash bag, they end up finding a couple of different letters that are to seemingly be like the prototype of this guy's like last message. And so they're like, oh, so maybe it is true. Maybe he did uh, go and just end him his own life. But they're like, but wait a minute. Now we have to figure out what the heck that other box that he was supposedly getting. What was in that box that he was supposed to get? Because this guy was calling and was saying that he was to get a box, but it was in some other room. So what ends up happening is both Charles and Mabel are to eventually go on and and try to figure out how to get into some other room. And at first, uh, we have like Mabel mentioning like, well, hey, how about we just go through this vent to go into this other room? And Charles is like, no, I know how to lock pick because I was in some like investigative show. And so all of a sudden, Charles is going on, and he is to tell this story to Mabel about his father, and how him and his father would easily pick up any instrument and be able to play it by ear. And like he ends up going on and on about the story where him and his father are just like one and the same, and that supposedly I think his father had left his mother, so maybe Charles was like thinking, well, maybe a life alone was like something that was just going to work out for Charles, because Charles was exactly like his father, so he didn't want to make the exact same mistakes that I guess eventually his father had made. So eventually Charles is to open this lock, and they eventually find out that within this box was some engagement ring. And so Charles was like, wait a minute. So why would this guy have thrown his life away when he was to have an engagement ring in a box to be married to someone? So, uh, so eventually what happens, like, we'll kind of comb through like the rest of these episodes to kind of like really get the gist of it. I think the second episode has a lot to do with Mabel and how she eventually is seemingly connected with the main story, which is to basically be this guy who had died. So the reason why Oliver wasn't here with both these two other people, with Charles and Mabel, Oliver had gone off to go and see his son, who evidently his son, one of his son's, like, I guess kids or something like that, is having a birthday party. So Oliver is to show up to his son's place, and like they're to kind of like catch up. And so eventually the main part of this dialogue is Oliver is to tell his son that, like, hey, could you loan me some money? Like, I'm kind of tapped out right now. Like, times are tough and I can't find work anywhere. Hence why Oliver is trying to put together this podcast for these three characters to eventually go and do this whole murder podcast that they are trying to figure things out. So Oliver's son is just like, you know what, like, how about you just sell your apartment and probably just live with his son. And Oliver's just like, no, like, that's my whole identity, that's my whole life. And then Oliver's son is like, well, maybe that's the problem, like, maybe that's maybe that's the wrong thing that you should be doing here, is like just having this apartment. And or maybe like you being attached to things just is like, maybe you should just not realize to be too attached to something. So that whole thing plays out. So we also have Mabel, who ends up starting to watch Charles's show, Brazos, and all of a sudden she ends up going into one episode where we have Charles all of a sudden going on and having this stretch of dialogue that seems weirdly familiar because it's the exact same line of dialogue that Charles had used on her during this whole door scene. And Mabel's like, what the heck? He gave me some line from some thing of his show. He lied to me. Like, maybe because it was Mabel who was kind of prying too much and asking too many questions, where maybe just Charles was trying to throw her off, because it's like, why is this girl asking way too much questions about me? Like, there's something fishy about this person. And plus, also, maybe Charles is to naturally assume that maybe, quite possibly, Mabel has some connection to quite possibly this murder. Maybe he's so smart because of all of his years of being a detective on a crime show that maybe he's starting to put pieces together that maybe Mabel doesn't even know about. Maybe? Probably not. So, so eventually Mabel eventually goes and confronts Charles about it to say, like, hey, you fed me that line from one of your episodes. And Charles is like, wait a minute, what? Like, that whole thing that I told you about my father? Like, that whole thing was something that I kind of ad-libbed or kind of wrote, like, some kind of lines onto that show. And, like, that was just something that I used in one of the episodes. And Mabel's like, well, then, like, why is it, like, line for line exactly what you told me on the show? And he's like, well, I guess just pure coincidence. It's just memory of it all. It's just like, I don't know. Like, it just happened. So, like, there's, I guess that resolved, but it's also just like, there's something fishy about this guy. and maybe we're gonna find out that Charles maybe like is much more of like a person that might be not really who he says he is, kind of thing. Because we still have kind of suspicions about everyone, and maybe we're trying to all figure out eventually what their motives are. And maybe the more and more we watch this show, we're going to find out maybe each one of these three people could have quite possibly had some kind of motive or some kind of connection to the person who had gotten murdered, and or some kind of connection somehow, to make this show a lot more interesting, where we're trying to figure out, wait a minute, like each one of these people could have possibly killed this guy, and like, okay, this is going to get really interesting. So uh so eventually we have seemingly another episode where all three of these people are to go down to this apartment meeting with all these people that live there. And so everybody is supposedly mourning the loss of this one guy, and they could not give a rip. They're like, dude, like, if anything, he was the guy that wouldn't let us use our chimneys, and thank God we can now do that because of this one guy. And Charles is like, wait a minute, like, he was the reason why we couldn't use our chimneys? What a garbage guy. So, uh, we eventually find out that every single one of these people in this apartment complex hated him. We also find out that there was one woman that wanted to buy this apartment from this guy to get more, I guess, extra space. And like, they were just like, like, maybe a lot of these people have some kind of motive for wanting to kill this guy off, because really they'd all just hated him anyways. So eventually there was to be this one guy sobbing and crying uncontrollably, and so maybe Oliver assumes that this guy actually knew the guy who died and is mourning his loss. And so all of a sudden, like, Oliver turns to this guy and like, hey, can you say any words about the recently deceased? So this guy is like, and it's like, Oliver's like, well, that's great and all, but could you uh like kind of hold back all the emotion and give me more words that I can actually understand. And so the guy is like really offended by this, and so he ends up mentioning that recently his cat died. And so all of a sudden everybody in the apartment complex starts to get really emotional about this cat dying, because evidently this cat used to kind of roam around this apartment complex, and like everybody used to or everybody knew that cat and really loved that cat. And so like I think Charles ends up saying like, wow, like it seems like people love that cat more than they liked this one uh, guy who recently died. So so yeah, like everybody's just kind of like piecing things together. So the second episode is to, let me pause here for a second. Let me do a reset. Okay. So in this second episode is to mainly be focused on Mabel. So Mabel is to eventually tell us through this second episode that it seems that her and the recently deceased were like people who were like childhood friends. That eventually, sometime more recently, that eventually they had a falling apart where the guy was to mention to Mabel that to basically treat him like he or that she doesn't know him, or vice versa. That eventually, if she's to ever bump into him, like never talk to him again. So there evidently must have been some falling out. We end up having this story where Mabel is to mention that her and two other guys used to be like childhood friends, and I guess she ended up calling them the Hardy Boys. Well, it seems like her and these Hardy Boys uh, were to have eventually gone and like gone to this one party, and it seems that one of these Hardy Boys, who is not the guy who is recently deceased, ended up getting engaged with this girl, and that wasn't Mabel. And so maybe we're assuming that that ring was supposedly to be Mabel's ring, and hence why, like, when Charles was asking for the ring from Mabel, Mabel's like, "Oh, it's in my place. Oh, I have it somewhere," and it seems like she didn't want to give it up. It's so, like, were we to assume easily that that this ring was supposed to be for Mabel, and now she's just realizing that this ring was going to be given to her before this guy died? Could be an interesting story here. So eventually, we end up also seeing that Mabel is to go into this guy's apartment and start to see a lot of these books all of a sudden have like a ton of jewelry inside of them. As if like this guy is just have all these fake books lying around that are just to be filled with all of this jewelry. And so are we to assess that this guy was some kind of thief of some kind, and that quite possibly maybe his person who he was selling this jewelry to was starting to get maybe to a point where he's like, "Hey man, I want more money from like selling your stuff," and maybe he killed him because of that. Maybe it came down to money. Maybe it came down to any number of things, or maybe the other Hardy Boy had killed this one guy. We don't know. Really, we just kind of have to put forth the pieces that it could possibly be anybody with the exception of Charles, because Charles was the only one who was to have seen this hooded character. But maybe Charles could have made a phone call. Maybe Charles could have been connected to the killer. We don't know. Or eventually we will, when eventually we see more of this show. So, uh, so eventually the thing that I'll kind of like rest this with is like the second episode is um, who eventually was Tim Kono, and like eventually like Mabel was to mention like, well, shouldn't it be who was Tim Kono? And like and we just have Oliver's like, well, like I already came up with the title, so it's too late. It's too late to change it. So like it was funny when both Charles and Oliver were in this like closet, which like Charles is saying like, God, I'm sweating in this closet, and Oliver just says like, well, it has this closet has the best acoustics out of the whole entire building. I'm like, why not the bathroom? Why doesn't the bathroom have the best acoustics? Wouldn't that make the most sense to go into a bathroom and do that podcast? That's just me. So they end up going and they start just like basically just describing Tim, and they like it seems like they know nothing about this guy whatsoever, to where they're just kind of like describing his maybe ethnicity to just try and get like a large amount of different kinds of viewers, uh, to just kind of generically just say it's like, well, it seems like his skin tone was of like these three kinds of people, so that way they can try to get these three kinds of people intrigued about this podcast. And so like Oliver is trying to like change up this podcast where it seems to reach the widest number of audiences. And so Charles is just kind of like, really, we're gonna have to say all this stuff within this podcast? And Oliver's like, well, yeah, like I think like it'll really be a hit. And Charles is just like, okay, whatever. So uh but yeah, so eventually I think that wraps up most of what was to happen in these two episodes. I kind of went all over the place with this one. Like I kind of wanted to do like the most important stuff, and I know everything wasn't perfectly down. because I kind of waited a day. Like I watched the first 2 episodes and I kind of waited a day because I had a lot of other projects going on, and so I wanted to come back to this and get this out so I can eventually do more episodes without the worry of me going like, oh, I hope I remember all of this, and hopefully I can piece this all together. So far, this show is really good. Hopefully, I kind of mentioned everything within these 2 episodes, but I think I'm also going to get out of here so I can either eventually get more videos done or watch more of the show and eventually be able to review more of it. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody. I'm trying to figure out if I got everything. Like, I'm trying to figure out if I said all of this stuff. Yeah, I think I feel good about it. Oh, well. Like, if anything, if we do this again, if there's another review to be coming out, then eventually I will probably rebuttal and be like, oh, yeah, I forgot about this, or I didn't mention about this, or whichever. So, with that said, bye, everybody.